Raging Abe Simpson and his grumbling grandson in The Curse of the Flying Hellfish is in my opinion the most underrated episode of The Simpsons. It's not that it received a negative response or anything. In fact, most of the reviews are generally praising, and with good reason. The cinematography, the lighting, the colour palette, this episode is gorgeous and stylized to high heaven. If I was judging Simpsons episodes purely on their overall visual style, I would consider only having 2 episodes as direct competition. From an aesthetic point of view, this episode should be up there as one of the show's hard hitters, so why isn't it regarded as one of the all-time greats? From what I've been able to find, this episode is lucky to get even an honourable mention on most top lists, and that's if it receives any acknowledgement at all, which 9 times out of 10, it doesn't. So if the visual style isn't the problem, maybe the substance of the episode itself isn't up to par. And to that I say, let me take you to church. The plot of this episode, when put simply, is Abe and Mr. Burns are part of the same war squad, the Flying Hellfish, in World War II, during which they stumbled upon some stolen paintings. The squad agrees to a tongue team, which means that the last surviving member of the squad will get the paintings. The episode takes place just after Razor Phelps, the third to last surviving member, passes away, leaving Abe and Burns as the only 2 left in the running, leading to what is essentially Mr. Burns trying to kill Abe, or to a lesser extent, get his key, for nearly 22 minutes. However, this episode's main focus, in my opinion, is on Abe's relationship with his grandson, Bort, and seeks to develop Bort's perception of his grandpa, from being embarrassed by his outbursts and crazy stories, to valuing those stories and realising that while not everything his grandpa says is gospel, can appreciate him and see him for the accomplished man that he is. This is set up well with the episode's opening scene, which showcases a Grandparents' Day plot point where Bart is understandably embarrassed by his grandfather's actions and ranting in front of his classmates and teacher. This episode's narrative is one of the most engaging and intriguing that I've personally seen. We get a little of Grandpa's history and deep-seated rivalry with Mr. Burns. This allows us to explore sides of the characters we haven't gotten a glimpse properly until now. We get to see arguably the darker side of Mr. Burns so far, with the episode showing us just how far he is willing to go to get what he wants. The rivalry between Abe and Burns is well established in both tone and rank from the very first encounter the 2 share in this episode, at fallen member Razor Phelps' funeral. Despite the 2 characters not having had much of any screen time, or interactions with each other before this episode, outside of a quick throwaway gag here or there, I'm always blown away by just how natural this dynamic feels. This scene alone makes me completely buy into the fact that Grandpa and Burns have this history, and have been at each other's throats for all these years. It also establishes the hierarchy of the episode, with Mr. Burns being treated with a seriousness that really helps us buy into the looming threat that he poses, in regards to wanting to be the last member standing, and make the paintings for himself. And with Grandpa being treated as the butt of the joke even in this scene, placing Burns firmly in the power seat for the majority of the episode. After the first 5 minutes, we have not only established the plot, history and stakes of the episode, but also clearly defined where each character stands in relation to one another, and allowing us as an audience to appreciate the development each undergoes. The episode then paces its following scenes very well. We have the assassination attempts, which, believe it or not, help to inject a little bit of humour into the episode, while also conveying to us the very real danger that Grandpa is in. The tonal shifts between Burns hiring an assassin and the gruesome scale of these murder attempts, countered by the hilarious outcomes that result from their failures, never fails to impress me. Abe retreats as fast as he can to the Simpsons household, and what follows is a flashback storytime scene that, while mainly set on a battlefield, is actually slower and more relaxed in pace, which contrasts nicely with the previous scene, and gives the audience a nice breather before the mile-a-minute thrill ride that is this episode's 3rd act. These flashback sequences being told through narrator stories to Bart are very nicely done. These flashbacks are interesting, well-paced, and beautifully stylized. Though I will say I've never been a big fan of his hair colour choice for a young Burns. The episode transitions well, going from a somber funeral scene to several violent assassination attempts, to Grandpa recounting tales of old to his grandson, to Mr. Burns smashing through the wall with a fucking crane! It should honestly feel more jarring than it does. I also have to say the twisting of the keys into the vault might be one of the most satisfying sound effects I've heard in the show. Also, did I mention the music in this episode is fantastic? This episode's use of lighting is my favourite in the show's entire run, and helps make for iconic frame after iconic frame. Have I mentioned this episode's gorgeous? And that reveal of Burns when Bart lights the flare magnifique! I adore how ham they go with Mr. Burns as the villain in this, and I don't mean ham necessarily as an over-the-top performance, I mean ham as in making the boy off the fucking rails in terms of his actions. Burns gives no fucks in this episode. He tries to have Grandpa killed, points a gun at a 10-year-old, and kicks him into a large box which proceeds to sink underwater before joyfully saying to Abe that he will see him at the reunion in November, with no regard for anything he's just done. Leading to an intense climax with beautiful light and pace and intensity, and with a narrative that makes you firmly invested in its outcome. Now, I won't go into the climax too much, as it's very much a treat that you need to experience. However, I can't ignore it completely if I want to explore the conclusion of this episode's narrative and character arcs. Abe has had a fucking enough. That sergeant deeply embedded within him comes out, allowing him to rescue Bart and chase down Burns. This, in my opinion, is possibly the best chase sequence the show has produced, in both pacing and visual prowess. Grandpa's done, look at that face, Burns gonna die! The chase ends with Burns on the floor looking up at Grandpa, who is now in the position of power out of the two. as the frame establishes having him looking down at Burns and refusing to stoop to his level, instead dismissing him and telling him to get out of his sight. The third act of this episode is so intense and engaging that it feels like it could be the third act of an action movie. I mean, an animated Simpsons action movie, but it's an action movie nonetheless. It's thrilling, it looks gorgeous, the music, it's got suspense, and it's got the funny. We have Grandpa stealing Flanders' boat, to which he joyfully complies. Grandpa having Bart pull on the rope 63 times for out of oxygen, and 64 times for pull me back up, I've got the box, and Smithers abandoning ship. This episode's got the funny. All of this then leads to Abe and his grandson defeating the big bad and ends with him dismissing Burns, giving a satisfying close to the rivalry and the stakes of the episode, before ending with what the episode set up from the very start. Bart acknowledging his grandpa with a newfound respect, and the two hug, ending the episode on a sweet and wholesome note. Oh yeah, and this guy calls him gay. What this episode treats us to above all is to finally give Grandpa what he was due. We finally get to see the hard-as-nails sergeant he was in his army days, the love he has for his grandson, and when it really counts he can see the day through to the end and come out on top. For me, this episode took Grandpa from a top 25 character at best and placed him firmly up there in my top 15, and every time I rewatch this episode, he gets a fair few days in my top 10. So why don't people go on about this episode? If it's not about the style or the substance, could it really just be something as simple as the title being too long? I've heard some people complain about how the ending feels like a "hey, none of the Simpsons can get rich" cop-out when the paintings are ultimately taken. But the paintings were a plot device, nothing more. It was never about the paintings, it was about the friends we made along the way. One common criticism I've heard from those who have talked about this episode in the past is that it lacks in the joke department, and to them I say, excuse me, what? Yes, this episode isn't exactly a laugh per second, but the jokes it does deliver, it really delivers. The assassin talking about the intricateness and subtlety of his plan only to burst into the retirement home with a machine gun and open fire. The nurse of the retirement home having a more powerful firearm on hand that she viciously fires in retaliation. Burns and Smithers dressed as the Simpson family. The family's lack of acknowledgement to Grandpa's banging at the door. In fact, the ending joke of this episode is one of the series' most quoted. It's not one of my personal favourite lines, but hey, I'm taking what I can get here. Mr. Burns attempting to exit in a villainous style only to crash into Lisa's room and is mistaken for Santa by a half-awake Lisa? Homer showing interest in joining Grandpa and Bart only to pass the second effort on his part is implied to be needed, and several more in the third act that I've already discussed. Don't get me wrong, I completely agree that this episode is very much story and characters first, jokes second. All I'm saying is that it's not as much of a distant second as many would have you believe. But hey, what good's my word, right? The only word that matters is yours. Your words. That's the beauty of subjectivity. No one gives a fuck. Maybe this episode is a solid 6 and I've wasted your time, but I firmly believe that to not be the case. I proudly rate this as my third favourite episode in the show's entire run. And if that isn't a convincing enough recommendation, I also just think it's neat. Now, even though I've just described most of this episode to you to the point where it may feel like you've watched it already, watch it. I really hope that you enjoyed this video, and please let me know of any other Simpsons episodes you think people underrate. Also, if you guys want to have your minds blown, check out Real Jim's Who Shot Mr. Burns series. If you are a fan of this episode, part 4 in particular will become your new favourite thing. Enjoy!
Bart, people just think our veterans deserve a little recognition. If I'm guilty of anything, maybe it's caring too much. I'm Bart Simpson.